Here's a question worth sitting with before anything else in this video. What would you actually find if you could see every single ship on Earth's oceans at once, including the ones specifically trying not to be seen? Because that question has a real answer now, for the first time in human history. For most of the 20th century, the high seas functioned as one of the last genuinely unmonitored spaces on the planet, too vast, too remote, and too expensive to watch consistently. Today, a publicly available tracking system means that, in theory, almost every large vessel on Earth broadcasts its own location constantly. And yet, according to researchers who study this data closely, somewhere between 72 and 76% of all fishing activity on the planet remains completely untracked. That gap between what technology now allows us to see and what we actually see is where this story lives. And at the center of it sits the largest, most heavily subsidized industrial fishing operation in human history, one whose ships gather, night after night, right at the exact edge of some of the most protected waters on Earth, forming a pattern so consistent, so geographically precise, that once researchers actually mapped it, it became almost impossible to explain as coincidence. Nobody built this fleet by accident, and nobody positioned it along this exact boundary without knowing precisely what they were doing. This is a story about oceans, but it's also, underneath that, a story about exactly the kind of power this channel keeps tracing across every video in this series. What happens when a single government identifies a piece of geography so vast, so unregulated, and so far from anyone's jurisdiction that it can simply build an entire industry specifically designed to occupy it, indefinitely, largely unseen? This is the story of the ocean's dark zones and what's actually happening inside them. To understand how anyone can know that 3/4 of global fishing activity is untracked, you first have to understand the system that tracks the other quarter and exactly why it fails so often. That system is called the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, and at its most basic level, it functions something like air traffic control for the entire ocean. Every sufficiently large commercial vessel is legally required to carry an AIS transponder, a device that continuously broadcasts the ship's identity, location, speed, and heading to any receiver within range, including satellites positioned specifically to pick up these signals from anywhere on Earth. The resulting dataset, remarkably, is public. Anyone with an internet connection can pull up a live map showing the real-time position of tens of thousands of vessels scattered across every ocean on the planet, a level of maritime transparency that simply didn't exist a generation ago. The problem is built directly into the hardware itself. An AIS transponder has a physical switch, and pressing it turns the broadcast off entirely. The moment that happens, the vessel simply vanishes from every public tracking map on Earth, an event researchers who study this phenomenon have given a specific name: going dark, along with a matching term for whatever the vessel does next: dark activity. There are legitimate reasons a ship's crew might do this. Vessels transiting waters known for piracy sometimes disable their transponder specifically, so pirates monitoring the same public data can't use it to locate them, since anyone with an AIS receiver can effectively see a real-time map of exactly which vessels are nearby and vulnerable, a genuine safety measure, though maritime law still requires the crew to document and explain the decision afterward in an official incident report, creating at least a paper trail even when the tracking data itself goes silent. But historical AIS records reveal a pattern considerably harder to explain away as simple safety precaution. Researchers combing through years of this public data have documented specific, repeated instances. A Spanish fishing vessel approaching the coast of West Africa in December 2012, disappearing from tracking entirely. An Australian fishing vessel near a protected marine reserve in mid-2015, disappearing when in the same way. A Panamanian-flagged fishing vessel approaching the Galapagos Islands in October 2014, going dark at almost exactly the boundary of protected water. In each case, researchers can see precisely where the vessel was the moment before it vanished, and precisely where it reappeared, sometimes hours or days later, often having moved in a direction that raises an obvious question. What happened in between, during the exact window nobody could see? What makes this pattern genuinely traceable, rather than simply anecdotal, is the sheer scale of the underlying dataset now available to researchers. AIS receivers, both ground-based and orbiting on dedicated satellites, have been logging vessel positions continuously for well over a decade, producing a historical record covering hundreds of thousands of individual vessels and, cumulatively, billions of individual position reports. Sifting through a dataset this large by hand would be functionally impossible for any individual researcher or even a large team working manually. It's only become analytically tractable because organizations dedicated specifically to this kind of maritime data analysis have built software capable of automatically flagging exactly this pattern: a vessel's signal disappearing near a sensitive boundary across the entire global dataset at once, surfacing incidents that would otherwise remain buried in an ocean, quite literally, of raw location data. What used to require a suspicious port official or an alert naval patrol noticing one specific ship behaving oddly can now be detected automatically, at global scale, simply by asking a piece of software to flag every vessel whose transponder happens to switch off within a certain distance of a protected boundary, then cross-referencing that list against months or years of accumulated history all at once. That question, repeated across tens of thousands of individual vessels and years of accumulated data, is what led researchers toward one of the most striking geographic patterns anyone has yet found in this dataset. A pattern that points, with remarkable consistency, toward one specific and completely legal stretch of protected ocean, and one specific country's fishing fleet clustered right along its edge. When researchers filtered this enormous global dataset down specifically to fishing vessels, then overlaid it with the boundaries of exclusive economic zones, the 200 nautical mile bands of ocean every coastal nation controls under international law, one location stood out with unusual clarity. That location is the water surrounding the Galapagos Islands, the volcanic archipelago off the coast of Ecuador famous as the setting that helped Charles Darwin develop his theory of evolution. This water sits entirely within Ecuador's exclusive economic zone, and a substantial portion of it carries additional protection as a marine reserve, specifically because it hosts an extraordinary concentration of marine life, sharks, sea turtles, and commercially valuable species, including jumbo squid and skipjack tuna. Fishing inside these protected boundaries by foreign vessels is prohibited under both Ecuadorian and international law. What the aggregated tracking data reveals is not vessels violating that boundary outright, at least not according to the visible, tracked data alone. It reveals something more specific and, in its own way, more unsettling. An enormous, dense concentration of fishing vessels arranged in a tight cluster running directly along the outer edge of that protected boundary, close enough to represent an unmistakable, deliberate presence, yet positioned precisely on the legal side of the line separating permitted international waters from protected Ecuadorian territory. Researchers examining this cluster have noted that its shape isn't random or diffuse the way ordinary fishing activity, drawn simply toward wherever fish happen to be most abundant, would typically appear on a map. It traces the boundary line itself with striking geometric precision, hugging the exact contour of Ecuador's exclusive economic zone for hundreds of continuous miles, a pattern that looks considerably more like vessels deliberately positioning themselves relative to a legal boundary than like vessels simply following fish stocks wherever they happen to migrate. Filtering the same cluster by the flag each vessel sails under adds the final, decisive detail. The overwhelming majority of these ships fly the flag of a single nation, China. Not a handful of vessels. Not an occasional visitor passing through. A concentrated, coordinated fleet, numbering in the hundreds of individual ships at any given time, arranged in formation along the exact boundary of one of the most ecologically significant protected waters on the planet. Ecuadorian officials have, at various points, publicly voiced concern about exactly this cluster, and Ecuador has periodically deployed its own naval vessels specifically to monitor the boundary and deter any incursion, a response that itself indicates how seriously the host government takes a presence. Its own tracking data suggests is, technically, staying just outside the line it's legally required to respect. Seen from directly above, using nighttime satellite imagery that captures the bright deck lights fishing vessels use to attract squid to the surface after dark, this cluster resolves into something almost impossible to process on first viewing. A dense, glowing grid of light stretched across open ocean, resembling nothing so much as the skyline of a floating city positioned in the middle of the Pacific, hundreds of miles from the nearest port. It is, by most available measures, the largest, most concentrated, most centralized fishing operation ever assembled in human history. It's worth pausing on the specific legal architecture that makes this cluster possible in the first place, because the arrangement is more precise than simply a lot of boats near a border. International maritime law grants Ecuador exclusive rights to the resources inside its 200 nautical mile economic zone, but it grants no comparable authority over the waters immediately outside that line, which remain classified as international waters open to any nation's vessels under the general principle of freedom of the high seas. That means a fishing fleet can position itself as close to the boundary as physically possible, drawing on whatever fish stocks happen to migrate across that invisible line, without violating international law in any way that could be prosecuted or even formally challenged. The fleet isn't breaking the rules of the system. It's operating with total precision at the exact outer limit those rules were ever designed to permit, a distinction that matters enormously for understanding why so much of this story remains, on paper, completely legal. Understanding how this fleet got there and why it operates exactly the way it does requires stepping back from the ocean entirely and looking instead at a specific set of deliberate government decisions made decades earlier, thousands of miles away. The story of how this fleet came to exist starts not on the high seas at all, but along China's own coastline in the 1980s. By that decade, decades of rapid coastal industrialization and a rapidly growing population's demand for seafood had measurably depleted fish stocks in the waters immediately surrounding China. Facing a domestic protein shortage that carried real political and economic weight, China's government made a deliberate policy decision. Rather than simply managing a shrinking domestic fishery, it would build an entirely new industry capable of harvesting seafood far beyond Chinese territorial waters, anywhere on Earth the fish happened to be. The state subsidized the construction of a distant water fishing fleet on a scale no other nation has approached, financing vessels specifically engineered to operate for extended periods deep in international waters, far beyond what a purely commercial, unsubsidized fishing operation could ever justify economically on its own. The resulting scale is genuinely difficult to grasp in isolation. Independent analysis places the size of China's distant water and industrial fishing fleet at somewhere around 57,000 vessels, a number that, according to the same research, accounts for roughly 44% of all industrial fishing activity conducted anywhere on the planet. That is not a leading fishing nation among several comparable competitors. It is, by a wide margin, the single largest fishing operation in the history of the industry, built and sustained through direct state investment rather than emerging organically from market competition alone. To put that scale in perspective, the next several largest distant water fishing nations combined don't approach even a fraction of this fleet's total vessel count, and no other country has attempted to build anything resembling the mothership-based resupply infrastructure that allows this specific fleet to operate continuously across ocean basins thousands of miles from its own coastline. The mechanism that allows this fleet to operate the way it does is a specific piece of maritime infrastructure called a mothership, more formally a refrigerated cargo vessel, or reefer. Under conventional fishing operations, a vessel eventually has to return to a home port to unload its catch, refuel, and resupply its crew, a logistical constraint that naturally limits how long any single ship can remain at sea, typically weeks rather than months, simply because storage space and fuel run out eventually, no matter how large the vessel. China's distant water fleet largely eliminates that constraint entirely. Smaller fishing vessels operate continuously in a given fishing ground, periodically rendezvousing at sea with a mothership that collects their catch, and in exchange transfers fuel, food, water, and other supplies directly ship to ship. In open ocean, far from any coastline, a transfer operation that itself requires considerable skill and calm conditions to execute safely between two moving vessels. The fishing vessels themselves never need to return to port at all. Only the mothership eventually makes the return trip back to China, fully loaded, while a fresh mothership arrives to take its place, allowing the fishing operation itself to continue indefinitely, months or, in documented cases, years at a stretch, without a single vessel ever touching land. A logistical innovation that functions, in practice, less like conventional fishing and more like a permanent, self-sustaining industrial operation that simply happens to be located at sea rather than on solid ground. It's important to be precise here about exactly what this arrangement does and doesn't represent, because the distinction matters for understanding this story accurately. The individual fishermen crewing these vessels are not the subject of this critique, nor is the Chinese population as a whole, the overwhelming majority of whom have no connection whatsoever to distant water fishing policy and no say in how it's structured. What this video is describing is a specific, deliberate state policy, a government decision to subsidize an enormous fleet, engineer it specifically to operate beyond the reach of conventional oversight, and in some documented instances, dispatch government-linked security vessels alongside commercial fishing fleets operating far from Chinese waters, a pattern several maritime security analysts have described as extending a broader state strategy of infrastructure-based influence, similar in structure to China's Belt and Road Initiative on land, onto the ocean itself. The scale of the subsidies involved is itself a significant part of this story. Multiple independent economic analyses of the global distant water fishing industry have concluded that a considerable share of these operations would be commercially unprofitable without direct government support, meaning the fleet's ability to remain economically viable at this scale, this far from home, for this long, depends substantially on continued state financing rather than the underlying economics of the fish being caught. That's a meaningfully different proposition than an ordinary private industry expanding to meet market demand. It's closer to a deliberate state investment in maritime reach and presence, with the fishing itself functioning as both the stated economic purpose and a convenient, plausible cover for a considerably broader strategic footprint extending into waters near dozens of other nations' coastlines simultaneously. That distinction between a specific government's industrial and geopolitical policy and the people of an entire nation is one this video is deliberately maintaining throughout, because collapsing the two would be both factually inaccurate and precisely the kind of unfair generalization a serious documentary account should avoid entirely. Understanding the scale and structure of this fleet raises an uncomfortable question that responsible journalism on this subject has spent years trying to answer directly. What are the actual working conditions like for the crews aboard these vessels, many of whom remain at sea for months or years at a time without ever returning to shore. The most extensive documented reporting on this specific question comes from investigative journalist Ian Urbina and his organization, the Outlaw Ocean Project, built on years of first-hand field reporting, including direct efforts to locate and board vessels operating in these exact fishing grounds, an undertaking that itself required chartering separate vessels capable of safely operating far enough out to sea to reach ships that, almost by design, are never found anywhere near a port. The facts, as documented through this reporting, deserve to be stated plainly and without embellishment, in keeping with the same journalistic standard this channel applies to every difficult subject it covers. Multiple crew members interviewed as part of this reporting described having their passports confiscated upon boarding, being held under multi-year contracts they had not fully understood or agreed to in the terms actually enforced, and being unable to leave vessels or return home despite explicitly requesting to do so. Some described conditions amounting to forced labor, a specific legal and human rights term referring to work performed under threat, coercion, or the removal of the ability to leave, rather than a general description of difficult working conditions, and a designation several international labor organizations have applied specifically to segments of the distant water fishing industry based on exactly this kind of documented testimony. It's worth noting, as any accurate account of this industry should, that commercial fishing is independently documented as one of the most physically dangerous occupations on Earth in ordinary circumstances, involving genuine risks from heavy equipment, exhaustion, and hazardous conditions regardless of any additional exploitation layered on top of it. International labor organizations have separately estimated that commercial fishing carries a fatality rate considerably higher than most other occupations tracked globally, a baseline risk that exists for every crew member on every vessel, entirely independent of whether that vessel is also engaged in any of the practices documented in this reporting. What distinguishes the specific cases documented in this reporting is the added element of confinement and coercion. Workers unable to leave a vessel even when circumstances became genuinely dangerous to their health, extending stays at sea well beyond what any voluntary contract would reasonably require, cut off from any outside oversight for the entire duration, a combination that transforms an already dangerous occupation into something considerably closer to captivity. This isn't a story about an isolated criminal enterprise operating outside the awareness of any government or company. It's a structural consequence of the exact mechanism this video has already described. A fleet engineered specifically to remain at sea indefinitely, resupplied entirely through motherships rather than ports, operating in international waters far beyond the reach of any single nation's labor inspectors or maritime authorities. When a vessel never needs to dock, the workers aboard it lose the one practical opportunity that would otherwise allow them to seek help, report abuse, or simply leave. The same infrastructure that gives this fleet its remarkable operational endurance is the same infrastructure that makes the people working inside it functionally invisible to anyone who might otherwise intervene on their behalf. It's worth being clear about who bears the weight of these documented conditions, because the reporting on this subject consistently points to a specific vulnerability rather than a random cross-section of any single population. Crew members recruited for these vessels are frequently drawn from among the poorest coastal communities across several Southeast Asian nations, recruited through labor brokers who, according to multiple documented accounts, sometimes misrepresent the actual terms of the contract being signed, the length of time actually required at sea, or the wages actually likely to be paid once debts and fees are deducted. That recruitment pattern, poverty-driven, cross-border, and mediated through intermediaries with limited accountability, is a documented feature of forced labor risk across the global fishing industry generally, not unique to any single fleet. though the specific scale and duration made possible by mothership. Resupply appears, according to the same reporting, to make the risk considerably more severe and considerably harder to escape once a worker is already at sea. Given how much of this activity happens specifically when a vessel's tracking transponder is switched off, a fair question follows directly. Is there any way to actually see what's happening during those exact dark windows when the ship itself has effectively made itself invisible? The answer, increasingly, is yes, though not through any single tool working alone. Researchers at organizations including Global Fishing Watch have developed a method that layers multiple independent data sources on top of one another, so that even when a vessel deliberately disables its AIS transponder, other forms of detection can often still pick up its presence. Nighttime satellite imagery can detect the bright deck lights. Certain fishing vessels, particularly squid jiggers, used to attract their catch after dark, lights visible from orbit, even when no tracking signal is being broadcast at all. Synthetic aperture radar, a satellite technology that detects large metal objects on the ocean's surface, regardless of lighting or cloud cover, can identify a vessel's physical presence even in complete darkness or storm conditions. Optical satellite imagery, essentially high-resolution photographs taken from orbit, can capture a direct visual record of vessels in a specific location at the exact moment the image was taken. None of these methods, used in isolation, provides anything close to complete coverage. Optical imagery typically captures a given stretch of ocean only once or twice a day, offering isolated snapshots rather than continuous tracking. Radar coverage is concentrated primarily near coastlines rather than across the full expanse of open ocean, in part because the satellites capable of this kind of detection are expensive to operate, and researchers have historically prioritized coverage of the coastal waters where illegal fishing is most commonly suspected. Nighttime light detection only works for vessels that happen to fish using bright lights in the first place, a method common in squid fishing. Specifically but far from universal across other fishing methods, meaning a bottom trawler or a long-line vessel operating with no exterior lighting at all would simply never register on this particular data stream, regardless of how long it stayed in one place. Each individual data source, researchers are careful to emphasize, has real and specific blind spots, and treating any single one of them as a complete picture of ocean activity would replicate exactly the same kind of false confidence that made AIS data alone so easy to exploit in the first place. What changes the picture entirely is layering these sources together. When researchers overlay radio frequency detection, radar imagery, and optical satellite photography directly on top of the exact locations and time windows where AIS tracked vessels went dark near the Galapagos boundary, a previously blank stretch of protected ocean, one that appeared completely empty and legally compliant based on public tracking data alone, suddenly fills with detected activity precisely inside the boundary those same vessels were supposedly staying outside of. A map that, using AIS data alone, shows nothing but open, unoccupied water inside the protected zone transforms, once these additional layers are added, into a map dotted with confirmed vessel detections sitting squarely inside supposedly protected territory. Direct visual and radar confirmation of a presence the public tracking record gave absolutely no indication of. It doesn't provide the same continuous, comprehensive picture AIS offers when functioning normally. But it provides something that didn't exist at all until relatively recently. Independent evidence, gathered through entirely different technical means, capable of directly contradicting whatever a vessel's own tracking data implies by its absence. When Global Fishing Watch combined all of these overlapping data sources into a single comprehensive global analysis, the resulting estimate was stark. Somewhere between 72 and 76% of all fishing activity worldwide remains untracked by conventional AIS monitoring alone. That figure doesn't mean 3/4 of the world's fishing vessels are necessarily engaged in illegal activity specifically. Some vessels are simply too small to legally require AIS equipment in the first place, a category that includes a huge share of small-scale, near-shore fishing fleets operating along coastlines throughout Africa and parts of Asia. Others operate in full compliance with regulations that simply don't mandate constant tracking for their particular vessel class. But the scale of that blind spot, the sheer, previously unquantified size of it, changes what researchers can honestly claim to know about ocean governance generally. Before this kind of layered satellite analysis existed, regulators and researchers alike were operating with a picture of global fishing activity that was, by this measure, less than a third complete, a genuinely startling gap for an industry responsible for feeding a meaningful share of the planet's population and generating billions of dollars in annual trade. Whatever portion of that untracked activity does involve illegal fishing, forced labor, or deliberate evasion of protected boundaries has been operating, until quite recently, almost entirely beyond anyone's ability to even measure the problem, let alone respond to it directly. And the scale of that blind spot is precisely why the newer generation of satellite-based cross-referencing tools represents such a meaningful shift, not because it solves the problem outright, but because it finally makes the true size of the problem visible enough to argue about with actual evidence rather than rough speculation. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually trace how a specific dataset reveals a pattern of state power operating in a space most people assume has no power structure at all. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because there's one more piece of this story worth understanding. What actually happens to all of this seafood after it leaves these waters, and why that matters to nearly everyone watching this video, regardless of where you live. According to Ian Urbina's reporting, once catch is transferred to a mothership at sea, it's frequently combined and mixed with seafood collected from numerous other fishing vessels, including vessels whose own tracking data shows no irregular activity whatsoever. By the time that combined catch reaches a buyer back in China, its individual point of origin, which specific vessel actually caught which specific portion, has effectively been erased entirely, a process sometimes described within the industry as the product being washed clean of its original supply chain, in much the same way that cash moving through multiple accounts eventually loses any clear trace of where it originally came from. This blending isn't necessarily done with deliberate concealment as its primary purpose. It's simply how bulk commodity processing tends to work at scale. But the practical effect is the same regardless of intent. A shipment that started partly with catch from a documented dark activity vessel becomes within a single processing step indistinguishable from catch that never had any irregularity attached to it at all. Some of that seafood is then processed in facilities that investigative reporting, including Urbina's, has separately linked to additional forms of documented forced labor, including Uyghur workers subject to state re-education and labor transfer programs, and North Korean laborers working in China under arrangements tied to the North Korean state. These are separate, independently documented allegations from the fishing fleet itself, worth naming honestly rather than glossing over, precisely because a serious account of this supply chain shouldn't stop at the boundary of international waters when the documented concerns extend further inland into processing facilities operating entirely within China's own borders under entirely different legal jurisdiction than anything happening at sea. From there, the seafood simply enters ordinary global commerce. Reporting indicates that roughly 70% of China's total seafood output is exported internationally, distributed through entirely conventional commercial channels to markets across Asia, Europe, and North America. Some of it becomes sushi in Japan. Some become seafood risotto or canned product across Europe. A significant portion arrives in the United States specifically as one of the most common items on American restaurant menus: inexpensive calamari, the kind served as a routine appetizer in restaurants that have no reason to know, and often no realistic way of finding out, exactly which vessel, operating under exactly which conditions, originally caught the squid on their plate. This isn't a black market operating at the margins of the legal economy. It's the ordinary, mainstream global seafood supply chain, functioning through entirely conventional importers, distributors, and restaurant suppliers who are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, no more aware of a given shipment's specific origin than the diner eventually eating it. That's precisely what makes this story different from a conventional smuggling or black market narrative. There's no single criminal syndicate to identify and dismantle, no hidden warehouse to raid. The opacity is built into the ordinary mechanics of how a global commodity supply chain works once individual shipments get blended together at scale, and a meaningful share of everyone watching this video has almost certainly eaten seafood that passed through some version of the exact system this video has just described, almost certainly without any realistic way of having known it at the time. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the maps and the satellite overlays fade into the background. The high seas were never actually ungoverned in the way the phrase suggests. They were simply unmonitored, and for most of human history, those two conditions looked identical from the outside, because nobody had the technical capacity to tell the difference. What this story actually reveals isn't the discovery of some entirely new form of lawlessness. It's the sudden, recent ability to finally measure a kind of activity that has almost certainly been happening at scale for decades, simply because the tools required to see it, satellite tracking, radar imagery, publicly aggregated data, only became available to researchers and journalists within the last several years. That timing matters because it connects directly to the same underlying thesis. This channel keeps returning to across every video in this series. Geography creates power specifically in the places where oversight cannot easily follow. A canal or a strait creates leverage because ships are physically forced to pass through a narrow, watchable point, the exact opposite condition from what this video has just described. The open ocean creates a completely different, almost inverse kind of leverage. Not a choke point that concentrates activity for anyone to see, but an absence of any choke point at all. An expanse so vast that whoever can afford to operate continuously within it, indefinitely, resupplied entirely from motherships rather than ports, effectively operates outside the practical reach of any single government's enforcement capacity. Where the Strait of Hormuz or the Panama Canal derive their leverage from being impossible to avoid, the high seas derive an entirely different kind of leverage from being almost impossible to watch, and a state wealthy and patient enough to build permanent infrastructure inside that blind spot gains something no choke point could ever offer. Not control over a narrow passage everyone else depends on, but the ability to operate, essentially unsupervised, across the largest unclaimed space remaining on the entire planet. China's distant water fleet didn't discover a loophole in existing law so much as it identified, and then deliberately built enormous state-subsidized infrastructure specifically to exploit. The one kind of geography no nation has ever fully figured out how to govern. Geography with no edges, no borders, and, until quite recently, no witnesses. Whether newly available satellite tools ultimately change that calculation in any meaningful way remains a genuinely open question, one that will depend far less on the technology itself, which now clearly exists and clearly works, than on whether any government or international body proves willing to act on what that technology reveals. International bodies, including the United Nations, have discussed strengthening high seas governance for years, and a handful of new treaty frameworks aimed specifically at protecting biodiversity in international waters have begun moving through the slow process of international ratification. But enforcement on the actual water, thousands of miles from any coastline, in territory no single nation has jurisdiction to police unilaterally, remains a fundamentally different and considerably harder problem than simply having better data, one that will likely require genuine multilateral cooperation between exactly the kinds of governments that don't always agree on much else. Data alone doesn't close an enforcement gap. It simply removes the excuse of not knowing the gap exists in the first place. There's a particular image from this story worth carrying with you after everything else fades. Hundreds of ships, lit up bright enough to be mistaken for a city skyline, floating in complete isolation in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, visible from space, and yet, for years, essentially invisible to the governments and regulators whose job it theoretically is to watch that exact stretch of water. That contradiction, visible from orbit and simultaneously unregulated on the ground, captures something true about how power still works in the parts of this planet no single nation fully controls. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought, and tell me what hidden corner of the map you want us to trace next. Because the ocean, it turns out, was never actually empty. It was simply the one place left on Earth still waiting for someone to finally turn the lights on.